So finally, after 5 years of scratching a living in flea-infested villages, we're finally going back to where we belong. The Colosseum.
Being a gladiator certainly has never seemed like a glamorous lifestyle by any means, but it can be surprising just how dark those times actually were. From battles that would cost over 2,000 men their lives, to the black market for gladiator blood, all the way to the disposal of the bodies after battle. On today's top 10 list, I'll be covering 10 dark things that gladiators did. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have how they faced death. Gladiators had to attend schools, which were called ludus, where they learned the rules and prepared for their fate in the arena. One of the main things that they are taught in these schools was how to face death. Honestly, this is not a college course I personally would have signed up for, but unfortunately these people didn't really get a say in their electives. They would have to practice the correct eye contact and posture, which, when they ended up in battle, could sometimes be the difference for them being shown mercy and death. This is because when a gladiator was down and about to be killed in a battle, his opponent would wait and look to the presenter of the games. This is because the presenter would then be the deciding factor on whether the fallen gladiator lived that day. During this pause for decision, the presenter and the crowd would look at the fallen soldier to see if he looked frightened or in pain. If he showed any signs of anything other than pure bravery, there was no way that his life was being spared that day. A fallen gladiator was meant to maintain eye contact, as well as even hold out his neck as if he was welcoming the sword. I couldn't imagine having to do this because, you know, I would be absolutely terrified like any regular human being would be. But the bravery was sometimes rewarded, and this was the way to have your life spared. Unfortunately, however, being spared didn't mean never having to fight again. You would still be put back into battle once your wounds were healed. In our number 9 spot today, we have no escape. Since most battles would only leave one gladiator standing, of course some people would have the idea to fake their own deaths in the hopes of being able to somehow escape in the end. While this is a smart idea, it wasn't necessarily an uncommon one, but of course a tradition was put in place in order to stop that from happening. After a gladiator faced his death, he would then be carried into a special room. In this room, they would remove all of the armor he was wearing, and then they would cut his throat, which is just a fact I wish that I could unlearn. Of course, this was to ensure that he definitely was no longer alive. What's even worse, however, is that this was only the practice for those who were considered to have died honorable deaths. For those who weren't considered to have died honorably, a slave would come out into the arena and hit their head with a large rock or club. This is obviously incredibly gruesome and disturbing. I suppose this is all to say that if you weren't shown mercy before your death, there is absolutely no way that you would be escaping it. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Noxii. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit that thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. In the times of gladiators, there were people who would be put into the arena called Noxii. These people weren't regular gladiators and were never well respected because they were actually criminals. They would be put into the arena because they were considered expendable fighters, which is obviously quite dark. Once in the arena, they would have to exclaim, "We who are about to die salute the Emperor," and then the battle would begin. Sometimes a bunch of Noxii would have to fight each other, but other times they were just more like props. They would even go into the arena with no armor, or even sometimes pretend armor, where the opposing gladiator would then make a spectacle out of them for the crowds. This is obviously a very gruesome and unfair form of execution that I am just very glad has not continued on. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Naumachia. The biggest gladiator spectacle is believed to have been created by Julius Caesar, and they were called Naumachia, which means naval combat. These battles were held by the Field of Mars in Rome on specially dug lakes, which when filled with water could hold a bunch of very large ships. These ships would hold around 2,000 prisoners who would be dressed as Roman enemies, and they would all have to fight amongst themselves, of course to the death. These insanely large spectacles of course needed a lot of people who would then be losing their lives. Because of the demand for people, prisons would usually have to completely empty all of their prisoners in order to make up enough people in these battles. That is just absolutely insane to me. These battles would apparently draw the largest crowds, some even exceeding 500,000 people apparently. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Emperor dress up. It wasn't an uncommon practice to see emperors play a little dress up game that was honestly pretty messed up. They would dress up like gladiators gladiators and step into the arena prepared for battle. This doesn't seem dark yet, but here's the catch. Their opponent would always be somebody who is at a disadvantage, obviously in order to ensure that the emperor was on a path to an extremely easy win. Some of the opponents would be someone who was missing a limb, or someone with a blunt weapon that couldn't do much damage. Sometimes they would even fight some kind of exotic animal, but of course made it easy for them to win again. One emperor who was known for doing this fairly often was Commodius, and he would dress up like Hercules since he was incredibly pompous and saw himself like a god. Clearly not so godly since he had to ensure his opponent was at a disadvantage in order to be able to win, but at least this is something we don't have to worry about anymore, and we can just remember him as a total jerk. In our number 5 spot today we have animals. Sometimes in an attempt to spice up the regular old boring fight to the death, gladiators would be put into the arena with an animal instead of another human being. As animals were very expensive, they weren't used every day, but the organizers of the battle would go all out for the fights that did include them. Sometimes the animals would be used to kill people who were considered undesirables, such as Christians at the time, which is just so crazy to hear. Most animals who were used in these spectacles unfortunately didn't make it out alive. That, combined with the fact that people loved when animals were included, led to a huge trade in exotic animals, which then drove some species really close to extinction and even caused hippos to disappear from the Nile. In our number 4 spot today we have taking things into their own hands. Many gladiators were unfortunately forced into this life. After all, I'm not really sure how many people would have been yearning for a chance to fight to the death just for entertainment of the crowds. Definitely not a line of work I would consider if it was an option. Since these people were being forced into these battles and they knew they most likely wouldn't see the other side, they chose to take a little bit of control and pass away on their own terms. Many prisoners chose to end their own lives before even seeing the inside of the arena. To make this already terrible situation just a little worse, taking your own life wasn't necessarily exceptionally easy in those days, so there are some pretty horrific accounts of how people went about this, which are honestly too dark for me to even discuss right now. One example I will talk about today though was more of a spectacle and kind of a movement. A 4th century politician put on an event one day where he gathered 20 gladiators and put them in an arena. They obviously fought until only one was left standing, and he ended up taking his own life in the end. This was something they hadn't seen before, so it obviously left everyone very confused. In our number 3 spot today we have gladiator blood. In a battle when a gladiator was struck down and was bleeding a lot, it was not uncommon to see a man running towards his body. This is unfortunately because the man wanted to drink the gladiator's blood like some kind of a vampire. This is pretty disgusting in my opinion, but if a man was seen doing this, it's because he was an epileptic, and at the time it was believed that the only cure was to drink blood directly from a gladiator's wound. How annoying would it be to go through all of that just to find out that that absolutely does not cure epilepsy? If a gladiator instead had a wound that was causing his insides to be outsides, his liver would be harvested and then sold as a cure for epilepsy. You would be instructed to eat it in 9 separate doses in order to heal yourself. I'm not going to lie, I'm not sure which one of these options is worse, because both are absolutely disgusting. I also think it's worth mentioning that gladiators' blood was also sold for regular men to drink because gladiators were idolized, and they believed that drinking their blood would increase their desires, for a lack of a better way to put it. Apparently this blood was really expensive, but I wonder how much of it was actually from gladiators. In our number 2 spot today we have gladiator burials. After a gladiator passed away, it was extremely common for them to be cremated. Their families would then be given rites where they would usually bury the ashes along with different offerings that they chose. Some places even had cemeteries that were specifically set aside for gladiators to be buried in. These traditions, however, were only in place for those who were considered to have died honorably. For those who had dishonorable deaths, they certainly were not treated well. If their bodies didn't get claimed by anyone, they would just toss their bodies into a river or even just some sort of wasteland. Even today this would obviously be considered a pretty horrible act, but it was even worse back then because of the fact that Romans believed that the soul could not rest until dirt covered the remains. In our number 1 spot today we have asking for mercy. After a gladiator died in battle, they would be carried out of the arena in a way that kind of honored their sacrifice and kept their dignity intact. But this was only the tradition for those who were considered to have died honorably, like we've talked about so many times already today. If a gladiator showed any kind of fear or hesitation, he was considered weak, and weakness was incredibly frowned upon in these times. I feel like being afraid of being killed isn't necessarily a weakness, especially for those who were forced into this position in the first place, but hey, I guess it's probably a good thing that things have changed since the days of 200 BC. If a gladiator asked for mercy and was denied it, this is another way in which he would have been considered weak and to not have died honorably. These people would then just have their bodies dragged from the arena rather than being carried. They thought that there was no reason to go through the hassle of carrying him when he already made such a fool of himself. I truly am very, very, very glad that I live at this time in the world rather than those times, because everything on this list made it sound really, really terrible. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye! Really a hair PSA. Saying that after being like they just got their throat slit seems a little aggressive. They sometimes would even fight sometimes gladiators would be put into the arena. A 4th century politician named... Nope, I don't know how to say that. As the man wanted to drink the gladiator's what? Is worth because... is worth. In our number 2 spot today we have gladiator burials. Burials. That sounds like a fake word.